Hello, everyone. This is another Heretic or Brother Nathan, whichever you prefer. So today I'm making this video. It's going to be a lot different than the content I've been making, the short content I've been making all week. I'm going to take a little break from the whole Epstein thing. Last night I had a really good conversation with my brother. We both actually agreed that we're going to delay the Epstein conversation until next week. Let things settle down a little bit. I know that I slept really well last night. Um, a lot of stress, a lot of energy has been expelled. And I feel like I have a much stronger and clearer focus. And rather than dwell so much on the issue, which is horrifying, I think that what we need to do with regards to this situation is start to talk about and brainstorm ideas on how to fix the situation apart from their systems. So what I've done is I spent most of the morning drafting something that I will make available for free. Okay. It will be available for whoever wants to contact me directly. I will email it to you. You have to remember, I took down my websites. I'm in the middle of sort of consolidating a lot of stuff and changing some direction. So if anyone's interested in that document, let me know. This is something that you can just print out at home, print out as many copies as you want, and post up everywhere. We need to spread the word. We need to raise awareness on this situation because it's awful. And it's high time that we start taking action and power and control back. So that being said, I'm going to try to give my testimony. I've not given my testimony before. I've had people request my testimony because they're curious about how I believed, what I believed before I abandoned Paul. So I'm going to try to give the very short story because there's so many different things in my life that have shaped my current worldview. If you've been following the channel at all, I drop information here and there. But I'm going to try to present the reasons why in one video here. So I grew up in an independent fundamental Baptist church, IFB for short. And the independent fundamental Baptist church movement is very conservative, very dispensational, very Zionist. So already you can see how all of this fits with everything that I talk about on this channel. We did not go to church often. We usually went to church for holidays, so Christmas, Easter. We would go to church if we were visiting a religious relative, so like my grandparents. My aunt would take my brothers and I to church with her children, her family, if we were visiting them. I don't know if they were the same denomination as what we were raised up as, quote unquote, but they were still very fundamentalist and I guess mainstream in that way. So that was my church exposure. We stopped going to church, according to my mom, around the time that we were stationed in Germany. And that's because my dad got offended by something the pastor said. Apparently that church did not, surprisingly, celebrate Christmas. And so the conversation that my dad and the pastor had about that subject were obviously offensive to my dad, and so we didn't really go to church much after that. Again, except for certain holidays and if we were visiting certain relatives. When my parents divorced around the year I was 10 or 11, so I was like late elementary school, just about to enter middle school when my parents divorced. And we definitely stopped going to church at that point because I was then in the custody of my mom, and she became completely disillusioned with it. Now, mind you, when I was a boy, around the age of 7 or 8, when we were living down in Georgia, just outside of Atlanta, I had said the sinner's prayer. I said the sinner's prayer because I was terrified of missing the so-called pre-tribulation rapture. My whole life, I was taught the dispensationalist doctrine, which is that God had one dispensation with the Jews, and Paul gave us a different dispensation, to the extent that we didn't even have to really care about what Jesus said in the Gospels at all. And I know that a lot of Christian denominations and churches don't make such a hard distinction, and a lot of churches give a lot more lip service to the teachings of Jesus. But in my upbringing, it was predominantly the epistles of Paul. Revelation was for the Jews. The book of Jude and James and Hebrews and First and Second Peter, that was for the Jews. The Gospels were for the Jews. So we literally only got our doctrine primarily from the teachings of Paul. And then the only relevance that the book of Revelation had was to show us the timeline of what would happen as the end time prophecies were unfolding. So I grew up hearing a lot about say the sinner's prayer. Once you're saved, you're always saved. And the way that you're saved is by faith alone, by grace alone, not of works, forever, no matter what you do. So I was very heavily steeped in mainstream evangelical fundamentalist strong conservative doctrine. I believed in the Trinity. I believed in the institution of the church. I believed in the hierarchy of the church as far as pastors, deacons, bishops, all that stuff. Going a little deeper, when I was very young, I was exposed to pornography via a friend. We were at a public park in Germany. Remember, we were stationed over there for the military. And situated sort of like, I guess, in the middle of the housing complex was this really vast park. And, there's trees and like small wooded areas kind of like around the park. And I remember playing there one day with a friend, and evidently he discovered something on the edge of a tree line, and it was a pornographic magazine. So we began, out of curiosity, not knowing what it was, flipping through it. And these images haunt me to this day. All of that to say this: I developed an addiction to pornography that stayed with me up until like somewhere between 3 or 5 years ago. It was a very rough and difficult addiction to overcome, and it almost cost me my marriage. So fast forward, my parents get divorced. We stop going to church. My friends all seem to somehow have access to pornography, and so I'm consuming it more and more. I actually, believe it or not, at a very young age, started to dabble in the occult. My friend said that he had started to learn how to practice magic from books that he found at the library. So before we left, um, at that time we were living up in, I want to say, Door County. So if you look at the state of Wisconsin, represented by my hand, Door County is kind of like up here on the peninsula. We lived right on Lake Michigan. And when we left there, I remember he wanted to do something for me before I left. And it was a spell. It was some sort of spell. He made something, I drank it. I put my intention into it. I was supposed to like sort of like wish, like make, he said make 3 wishes, and I made 3 wishes, and the scary thing about that is that they came true. And I believe that ever since then, up until college, I was plagued by demons. I had we lived in like haunted houses and stuff. It seemed like no matter where we went, these sorts of things would kind of follow, and it got worse and worse up until I reconverted and came back, quote unquote, to Jesus and to the church and stuff. And then, I that's a whole nother story in and of itself. But suffice it to say that I was going down a dark path. Um, by the time I was like middle school, high school, um, well, especially in high school, I want to say around sophomore year, I started to get into the high school party scene with my friends. We would have parties where there would be drinking and stuff. I started to smoke pot, which still to this day, personally, I don't have a problem with. I would much rather people smoke pot and marijuana, use cannabis, than drink alcohol. My alcohol of choice was not beer. So when at these parties, I would drink like the harder liquor, and things just would get out of hand. I was a fun drunk. I wasn't belligerent or violent, but let's just say I was sort of becoming a party animal. Um, but I really didn't stick with drinking. That did not have any hold on me. I've smoked tobacco before. That didn't have any sort of grip or hold on me. It was the pornography that had a massive grip on me. Um, so I'm not going to church. I'm getting involved in things that I shouldn't be involved in. There's this darkness around me. I would watch ultra violent horror movies, and I really enjoyed the gore. Um, Still to this day, I'm a cinephile. I love to watch movies. Um, but I've since learned that there are certain lines that I can't cross anymore. Um, so it was a very dark time. And mind you, this whole time, I think that I'm saved because I said the sinner's prayer. And essentially, my theology was, well, Jesus knows my heart. We have our own thing going on. And maybe when I'm older, I'll become more religious, which is pretty typical for mainstream kids, right? A lot of testimonies are sort of that way until there's revelation and you're actually caused to repent. So when I started going back to church, it was after high school and very early on in my college career. I was going to a 2-year community college to get my associate's degree before I transferred to the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, where I pursued a bachelor's degree in English with an emphasis on writing. And then I had a print journalism minor. and that's what I graduated with. I wanted to be a teacher. And in fact, I was a teacher in the public school system for exactly 1 school year, and I haven't done that since. But anyway, I start going back to church at the invitation of a man who I was playing music with. We had started a band. It consisted of myself and 2 other guys who were my friends. One of them was actually a dorm mate of mine. We were very, very close friends. He was one of my best friends. We still have a relationship today. But at that time, we were jamming together, playing music together, and then we started going to church together. And that particular church was a non-denominational, charismatic, word of faith leaning church. It was a small church. And I remember the first time I went there, it was the first time I'd ever seen a band with drums, keyboard, guitar, bass, and vocals on stage performing worship songs. I was from a much more traditional shirt and tie and hymn singing church tradition. So this was very new to me. And the other thing that I noticed, which really struck me, was the so-called gift of tongues. But I was so moved somehow by this experience that I made the conscious decision at that point to follow Jesus no matter what. So you could say that it was at that moment, it was like those first few visits, I was beginning to consciously decide to rededicate my life to serving God and Jesus. I did not know what that meant. And I did not know that it would be such a tumultuous and difficult, but very rewarding journey. In fact, around this time, I was dating the girl who would become my wife. I just graduated high school. She was finishing up high school. We had just started dating. She graduated. I started going to church. And I remember telling her, I'm going to start following God with or without you. And she chose to stay with me. And she's stuck with me ever since, through everything. But needless to say, I have this new zeal. And so I'm reading the Bible a lot. This is the first time I'd ever read the Bible myself. So I am reading the Bible constantly. And I naturally begin to have a lot of questions. And so, like a good, dutiful, zealous Christian with all these questions, I go to the deacons and the pastor and I start asking them questions. And they would attempt to give me their best answers. And that was sort of my first foray into beginning to question what I was being taught right away. Because I could very clear, and this is just one example of many, I could very clearly see from my own reading in my own Bible that the gift of tongues, for example, was not this strange phenomena of unintelligible babbling, but it was rather a very unique gift of the Holy Spirit that enabled people who had different languages to communicate and understand one another clearly, despite their language differences. So I understood that the gift of tongues was an undoing of the issue of the Tower of Babel. And I began to take these sorts of questions to the leadership, and they would play the game that most people play, which is, well, it's not a gift for everyone. We don't really make it a big deal here. If you want the gift, you can have it. You don't have to have it. So they weren't very strict. Like some churches are very strict with if you don't have this gift, then you're probably not saved. It wasn't that sort of environment. It was very, I'm sorry to say, for anyone from that church listening, it was a very watered down sort of message every Sunday. I remember there being one sermon on sin. The rest was just the pastor's best attempt at being like a Joel Osteen or Rick Warren type. Okay. Very friendly people, very well meaning and sincere, in many ways very godly. But also I could see that there is some issues here. There was no depth of teaching as far as explaining what the Trinity was. There was no foray into church history, anything like that. It was just very, very simple. So I became disillusioned with that. I'm not there and by the way, that was the first time I'd ever been baptized. I made a conscious decision. My friend and I actually were baptized on the same day. So, then we transfer. We're still going to these sorts of churches. Now we're in a different town, not too far away from the town that we left, which was Janesville, Wisconsin. So we go from Janesville to Whitewater, which isn't a great distance, but it's far enough to where we'd have to drive to come back. So we would start driving to come back to church, and I was becoming disillusioned at this point. I was reading the Bible nonstop, listening to the Bible nonstop, and I thought, why aren't we talking about the rest of the Bible, right? Why aren't we talking about Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy? Like, there's so much stuff. Really, the only purpose it seemed those books had was to like talk about creationism, talk about the fulfilled prophecies of Jesus being the Messiah, and then we would like look at Daniel and Revelation and talk about end times and stuff, right? So I started to ask questions like, why aren't we talking about this other stuff? So I started to read that other stuff, and I started to seek out teaching that was talking about this other stuff. And I was deeply struggling with these demons inside of me. And I was disillusioned already. And I thought there's not really a whole lot of power here. And I'm not really feeling supported in this particular community. So I started to look elsewhere. And it's at that point that I encountered a hate group. This particular hate group is based out of Phoenix, Arizona. And unironically, it formed out of the IFB. So I was raised IFB. This church is IFB. And it was the hard preaching kind. So, the kind of preaching where there's yelling and screaming and Bible thumping at the pulpit. A lot of door-to-door, quote, soul winning. And the very conservative dress where men wear shirts and ties. They have short hair because long hair is feminine. Women have to wear skirts and all this stuff. And I think at that time I needed that sort of structure. And so I fell right into it. Only this particular group was basically the Westboro Baptist version of IFB. Westboro Baptist is Calvinistic. This particular church definitely was not Calvinistic, but it still had the same hateful message. And so I got caught up in that. So while I was at Whitewater, despite falling into this sort of cult, I was active in the on-campus ministry there, Campus Crusade for Christ. And so there I was exposed to several different denominations that I didn't even know existed. I was in Bible studies with Catholics, Lutherans of all sorts, Orthodox. There were Mormons that would go. A lot of it was predominantly non-denominational, of course, as the ministry itself is non-denominational, but it's still very conservative and fundamental in its doctrine. It's very orthodox, right? If you look at the nine, well, it's basically, they have the Protestant solas and then the fundamental doctrines of like the Trinity and that sort of thing. So I have even more questions now because I'm learning that there's all sorts of these different denominations that I was not formally aware of. We're all in Bible study together. We all have different interpretations, but we're all reading, allegedly, the same letters, the same gospels. And I got to say that by the time I graduated college, I had read the Bible more than 15 times. So I had a lot of questions, and I wasn't getting answers from these non-denominational churches. So again, just being disillusioned, I fell into that cult. We moved down to Phoenix, and I took a job in the public school system as a 6th grade teacher. Hated it. But it needs to be stressed that everything around this time centered around Paul and his teachings. We were debating each other over what Paul meant here. Why does Paul say this? Why aren't we doing that? These were my sorts of questions, and I wasn't given, I think, good answers. And I think that my questions were legitimate questions. Eventually, so we were down there for less than a year. I want to say we lived in Arizona for like 10 months before we left that church and we came back to Wisconsin. I became disillusioned with that church. Thank God I left because it was a cult. It was a hate group. And that's counter to Christ. So came back north. We joined another church. There's so much stuff. I mean, in my quest for truth, I have gone to Lutheran Bible studies. Of course, I'm in this ecumenical environment with Campus Crusade for Christ. So I'm doing all these Bible studies with all these people, but eventually I became so disillusioned that I would just go to any church I wanted, and it became a sort of auditor. So I would go to churches, I would sit in, I would approach the pastor, ask my questions. I would approach the so-called leadership, ask my questions. I would try to arrange conferences and meetings with these people so that I could have my dilemmas resolved, so I could have my questions. And meanwhile, not only am I reading the Bible very heavily, but I started to look at church history. And that opened up a whole nother can of worms. And by this time, I'm completely disillusioned with the apologetic answers that I'm being given. I'm noticing copy and paste theology, and I'm noticing that there's just this script and that people were uncomfortable with asking questions. So I've studied the Bible with Catholics, Lutherans, Seventh-day Adventists, Seventh-day Baptists, Missionary Baptists, Hardshell Baptists, Independent Fundamental Baptists, non-denominational, charismatic churches, non-charismatic, non-denominational churches, Hebrew roots. I've sat down with Jehovah's Witnesses multiple times. I've let them into my house and I've let them take me through their literature. Mormons. It goes on and on. I feel like I've made every effort to attack my questions from every conceivable answer. I even found some local Bible students, which are the precursors to the Jehovah's Witnesses, and I did Bible studies from them, and I've read their literature and all this stuff. Mennonites, Anabaptists, Amish, all sorts of stuff. Okay. I've been deeply engaged with so many different communities in my quest for truth that I would say it's a lot more comprehensive than what most people experience. Because I find that most people will maybe convert once or twice maybe in their Christian walk. Most people, I've noticed, become quite happy and comfortable once they find community, right? Because that's just our nature, but it's not mine. The things I started to notice is that people tend to quote Paul more than Jesus. People have this anachronistic theology. They're incorporating mid to late 4th century dogma, which is verifiably born out of the Catholic Church, the fledgling Catholic Church, and they're reading these creeds and these dogmas back into 1st century Palestinian Jesus movement. That's an undeniable fact. I abandoned the Trinity when I came to the very easy and logical conclusion that God sanctified the 7th day as Sabbath, not just for Jews, but for Adam and Eve, for man and woman. Adam and Eve do not represent only Jews. Adam and Eve represents mankind. So once I came to that conclusion, which was very simple for me to do, in my studies on Sabbath, I also began to discover that there was the same issue with the Trinity. That just like the Catholic Church changed the Sabbath from the 7th day to the 1st day, they also changed the deity from a singular being and person to a plurality of persons somehow. And it just became evident and obvious to me. And so that was probably the largest crack that formed in the dam. And once I just accepted those things, the dam really began to crumble and the water really began to burst forth. From there, I became a Unitarian. So I believe that the Father alone is God. And that means that Jesus is not God. And it was not long after I came to that true conclusion that I began to question a lot of what Paul had to say. And then I would say that the rest is history from there. I've rejected Paul. I've rejected the Trinity. I've rejected the virgin birth. I've rejected penal substitutionary atonement. I've rejected the dispensationalist pre-tribulation secret rapture. If you could say that my theology largely is summed up by this statement. If a Catholic or Protestant believes it, I probably don't believe it. And I gotta say that when I made the decision to listen to exclusively to filter everything through Jesus Christ alone, like what the Father tells us to do, this is my beloved Son, listen to him. Okay. Once I adopted that as my standard of interpretation, scales began to fall off my eyes like never before. I was more free from my pornography addiction. I was set free from a lot of food addiction, just eating junk and really just gaining self-control and self-mastery like never before. Because Paul, I believe, was a definite roadblock in my sanctification. When he says things, I'm not going to get into it. Okay, if you want to know greater details about what specifically, you're welcome to ask in the comments. I've written about this a lot, and I can send you my work on it. Other more brilliant people have written about this. But suffice it to say that I didn't have the victory with Paul plus Jesus as much as I've had the victory with Jesus alone, which is what we supposedly all say, isn't it? We all say faith alone, Christ alone, right? But then we add in all these other people who have come after Jesus. We ridicule the Jehovah's Witnesses for following Charles Taze Russell. We ridicule the Seventh-day Adventists for following Ellen G. White and accepting her visions. We ridicule the Mormons for their acceptance of Joseph Smith and his visions, but no one questions Paul. No one questioned Paul. And it became a nagging, obsessive question, like all the other questions before. And I just became, I think, reasonably and logically disillusioned with Christianity entirely. You know, I went from a porn addicted man of extreme violence, someone who was calling for the public execution of my enemies, and I would not have bat an eye. Someone who was willing to kill people who believed differently than me because I was part of a hate group. And also because I had a lot of anger from trauma that I'd experienced as a child, plus this addiction, plus all these addictions. It wasn't just the one addiction. It was, like I said, just a total lack of self-control and misguiding. And Jesus set me free from that. It's not to say that people who somehow accept Paul as an apostle, despite the fact that he's not. It's not to say that there aren't people out there who do godly things and who walk in the power of the Spirit of Christ, despite Paul. That's true. There are people out there who, despite Paul, who despite the Trinity, who despite all this falsehood, they're good, godly people. But I've also come to accept the fact that there's just good, godly people out there all over, regardless of what they believe, because I've learned that fundamentally, I don't think it's true that humans are, by their very nature, corrupt and depraved. I don't believe in original sin. I don't. I believe that mankind in general is largely deceived by the god of this world, which is Lucifer. But I believe that we're all created in the image of God, and that because we're all created in the image of God, that we all are capable of doing good. So, I feel like a lot of Christians, they struggle between a rock and a hard place because they labor under the burden of this flesh. Oh, the flesh is so evil, this corrupt body, I can never do good even though I want to. There's no power in that message. The Christian church has the same, if not the worst, divorce rate as everyone else, and they make excuses for it because Paul allows them to make excuses for it. So they eat all sorts of things that they shouldn't be eating, and they have the same health issues as the rest of the world. That's a problem. Well, no surprise. Paul says you can eat anything. This is the fruit of Christianity. Doesn't matter what you eat. Bodily exercise profiteth nothing, right? The flesh is evil. Only the spirit's good. Okay, tell me, Pastor, how do I walk in the spirit? Oh, well, okay, well, does it have anything to do with what Jesus said here, where he says, if thou wilt have eternal life, keep the commandments? No, of course not. So that's largely my testimony. I don't know if that helps anyone. I hope it adds clarity. And again, this is just the abridged version. There's so many different intersecting elements, and there's a lot more depth to it than that. But I think this is basically the best way I can summarize my particular spiritual journey. And I'm still learning. I still could be wrong about a lot of things, no doubt. But I have some verses here that, especially one in particular, has really helped me in my walk. Okay, right here is Proverbs 21:16. The man that wandereth out of the way of understanding shall remain in the congregation of the dead. It was that verse that I read. When I read this verse, and many years ago, sitting in that non-denominational charismatic church, I thought, there's no power here. It was very evident to me, and I believe that it was revealed to me by the Spirit of God. I believe that the Spirit of God led me to this verse. And this verse I've held on to all that time, that when I walk into a congregation and they're talking about this, but they're not willing to talk about that, they don't allow questions that are legitimate, good questions. The pastor gets frustrated and exasperated by your constant question asking, and you start to kind of feel a little ostracized and unwelcomed because you don't stop asking questions at Bible study, or you make inconvenient remarks when you mention inconvenient facts from history, and you start to feel unwelcomed in these places. You know that you're amongst dead people, blind people. And I don't want to follow blind leaders with blind people and fall into a ditch. And I feel like the church at large, the entire structure, the system, and the doctrine is designed to keep people trapped. I really do. In John chapter 4, Jesus said that there is coming a time, the time will come and now is, when they will neither worship in this mountain nor in Jerusalem. For God is a spirit, and they that worship God must worship him in spirit and in truth. So pray, tell, where in there does it say you have to go to a particular place at a particular time every week? To me, that strips the entire meaning and purpose away. One of the things that helped me is realizing that the Bible just has errors in it. There's obfuscations. The word is not church. I'm sorry. That word has undoubtedly become associated with a particular building, with a particular structure, and a particular affiliation, and it requires state approval for 501c3 tax status. No, that's wrong. Jesus intended that the kingdom of God first be within you, and then it radiates out to those who you come into contact with and build organic relationships with. The people who you pray with, the people who you pray for, the people who you have actual commonality with. And I've never felt that anywhere else, except for with the very few small circle of people who I'm able to fellowship with online. I believe that we're intended to be scattered. And it's very simple. When an assembly comes together, they don't need the state's permission. We can get together, we can collect money together, and we can do with the money whatever we want, so long as it helps the community and doesn't enrich other people over the others. And it's none of the church's business what we do with our money, or it's none of the state's business what a church does with its money, so long as the church isn't doing criminal activity with the money. So we don't need to tell them anything. But yet, so many people are under the impression that in order for us to function as the body of Christ, that we somehow have to have these title deeds and this property, and then you start getting mixed up with this 501c3 garbage. And I believe that comes from Paul. I think Romans chapter 13 is very clear that he wants us to be in subjection to the authorities, or else we're going to experience persecution. I'm not afraid of persecution like what most Christians are. And I think that's evident. When the state said, shut down your church in the pandemic, every Paulinist church shut down during the pandemic. Very few disobeyed. Most of them because they wanted to keep their precious 501c3 charitable church tax exempt status. They obeyed. Why? Romans 13. So, as far as I'm concerned, Paul is one of the largest stumbling blocks that could ever be in a person's life. I believe that he basically was a proto-Jesuit, that he was a wolf in sheep's clothing, an infiltrator with the modus operandi of, I become all things to all men that I might by all means save some. That is almost verbatim the Jesuitical modus operandi. And I'm tired of pretending that it's not. I grew tired of pretending that wasn't the case. And I'm dismayed that people don't have the discernment to know that is the case. It is the case. There's no debating it. So that's my testimony. If you would like to debate with me about this, we can arrange a format. We can try to find a moderator, and we'll try to keep it civil. But I'm going to tell you right now, you're wrong. Paul's a false apostle, and you need to filter everything through the words of Jesus Christ, and ultimately listen to him alone. And one thing that will help you is just you have to dig more into church history. And I can provide you resources that will help answer your questions and point you in the direction which I believe is the truth. Because it set me free from so many. It was weird because despite the promise of faith alone, Christ alone, once saved, always saved, which I learned from Paul, which is in his letters without a doubt, despite that teaching, which is supposed to be a comforting teaching, despite that, I had constant doubt over my salvation. Constant doubt over my salvation. And it's because I knew that I was still bound in darkness. I just couldn't bring myself to accept it. And it was literally once I rejected Paul and accepted Christ alone, truly, that I became free. And there's one more proverb. I have it memorized, but I don't have the reference for you, so I'm going to look it up. Okay. Proverbs 16:3. Okay. Commit thy works unto the Lord, and thy thoughts shall be established. I would say that's the other proverb which has really helped pull me through. And you say, Nathan, those are proverbs. Those aren't the teachings of Jesus. Well, I think you're mistaken because Jesus is the embodiment and the fulfillment of wisdom. And Jesus's teachings sound a lot more close to this than Paul, because Paul says salvation is not of works, lest any man should boast. Well, I tried that, and I was in constant doubt of my eternal standing before the Creator. But it was not until I rejected Paul and started filtering everything through the lens of Christ's teachings that this verse finally made sense to me. Commit thy works unto the Lord, and thy thoughts shall be established. I have no regrets. As the old song goes, I've decided to follow Jesus. No turning back. No turning back. There is no power or hope in the false gospel of that false apostle Paul. He is a child of Satan. He is leading many away. He is causing many to stumble. And if anyone is saved, it's despite Paul. And it would only be by the mercy and grace of God. So it would be because they're actually producing the fruit that Jesus told us to produce, but Paul was not doing it. He was not doing it. So I hope that helped. Have a good day.